Welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. You can find Natasha on Facebook at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CSTS, and at Natasha Helfer MFT on Instagram and TikTok. You can find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The intro and outro music for this episode is by Otter Creek. This podcast was edited by Ashley Piccini.
Hi, this is Natasha Helfer, and this is my podcast. I'm a relational sex therapist, and here's where we try to attack some shame and get healthier through education, stories, and relationships. And I am so thrilled that I've got Lisa Diamond as episode 1 of my rebranding, because I've been podcasting under Mormon Sex Info, and I'm wanting to expand a little bit about the things I get to talk about. So I'm just thrilled to have you. And I kind of want to break out in song. I don't know, Lisa Diamond, Sweet Caroline.
Oh God, that's
Is that just
terrible.
crazy? Is that crazy? I don't know. I know you have nothing.
But I am just as happy. I feel like our lives have been circling each other, and finally, when you moved back to Utah, we connected, and it's
Well, and I want to talk about that. I mean, so you're a professor at the University of Utah. You are a professor of developmental psychology, health psychology, gender studies, and your research has focused on sexual orientation development, sexual identity, social safety, which is a lot of what we've been talking about. You're best known, I believe, for your book that came out in 2008. It was called...
Which now seems like forever ago.
Right? Yeah, it's 2008. That's a long time ago. Called Sexual Fluidity, Understanding Women's Love and Desire, where you discuss fluidity of female sexuality, which is based on a study of 100 non-heterosexual women over a period of 10 years. And this was groundbreaking work.
It's actually now 30 years. I'm trying to see if I can get someone to join with me to make a documentary series about the 30-year follow-ups.
Oh, wow. So you've continued to follow.
I haven't published much on it, but I contact them every 5 years.
Okay. So, and this is groundbreaking in a lot of ways. I think it carries huge implications worthy of discussion, which is what I'm super excited to talk about today, especially for faith communities. I remember hearing about you as I was becoming a sex therapist and going through my training. And part of me was kind of very excited to hear about your work. And part of me was like, no. I will share why I had that reaction.
Oh no, everyone does.
And the reason why is because I come from a high demand religious background myself. I work with lots of different people from faith communities, from different kinds of high demand religions, where this argument of choice, has been used against LGBTQ plus populations forever, so it's a choice to be gay. Therefore, God doesn't want you to be gay. Therefore, you need to choose not to be gay. Therefore, just be a good person and don't be gay, right? That's kind of the idea.
And if you didn't choose it, then you get the shame escape card. And I have so believed that the motivation for the Born That Way argument was, hey, I know this is a shameful thing. This culture finds it to be the most shameful thing possible. But shame has to be associated with some choice. Like if I didn't do it, I don't have to be ashamed. So one of the reasons your work has always spoken to me, because I've always felt that the Born That Way argument was a shame-centered argument. How can I escape the shame that my culture will? Well, I'm blameless. I'm blameless. If I'm blameless, then I don't have to be ashamed, right? But if there's one iota of conscious intent, then the shame belongs to you. You own it 100%. It was always a shame-based argument from the beginning. And it was almost like saying, oh, yes, we should live in a world governed by the primary motive is to escape shame. And if you're going to choose to live in that world, then the Born That Way argument is the only way to be gay. And the more radical shift is to say, maybe maybe I just don't really maybe I don't have to live in a shame-based world. Maybe I can actually decide that doesn't, but that is a shift that many people are not ready to make.
Well, and to this day. And so, yeah, as I'm setting up kind of the discussion I want to have today, that was exactly my concern, right? Is if we start talking about sexual fluidity, then the little bit of progress that we were starting to make exactly from the shame-based perspective, which is, well, if you're born this way, you can't help it. Therefore, now we're going to have to accommodate you, maybe, because we still haven't.
Yeah.
We still haven't accommodated gay people. Lesbian.
But we accommodate you as if it's like a disease. Like, oh, so sad that God burdened you with this.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to be ashamed. You can just be sad about it. But the potential for just having a joyful life is off the table from the beginning.
Correct. So then I was very afraid that we'd go back to this whole, well, it's a choice. So therefore you have to then, we'd make backtracking. That's why I had this reaction to your work.
I remember some of the first talks I gave here in Utah, because I didn't know anything about the culture here. And I remember I spoke to affirmations, which was it was initially, I think it changed over the years. Initially, it was just like a Mormon parents of LGBT folks. And I talked a little bit about sexual fluidity. And then someone came up to me afterwards, because at that time, I really thought fluidity was more common in women than in men. I'm not convinced that that's true. Or I think if it is true, it's probably more cultural than anything else. But this guy came up to me and he was like, wow, you have explained to me why I can have a really good relationship with my wife, even though I'm gay. And like, I love her strongly enough to like be in this marriage, even though I'm still gay. And like, a lot of people think that's not possible. And you showed me that. And I remember thinking, this is what, like, no, I don't want to provide a motivation for gay people to get married and hope that they will fluidly become attracted to the spouses that they were not attracted to. Like, I was like, well, that's a creative use. And it became immediately clear that my work was hitting this culture differently and in a way that I was not really prepared for. And I wanted to be like, oh, that's great. And then it'd be like, ooh. And that has been like the theme of the last 23 years in Utah.
Yeah, right. So I just heard you talk at the Rocky Mountain Sex Summit, which you did an amazing, fabulous job. There were so many things that you were talking about where I was like, oh, I could talk to you about an hour for that. I could talk to you about an hour for this. Talk to you for an hour for that. And by the way, you got in touch with me like, I don't know, sometime this last summer, which was probably one of the pinnacles of my career. I was like, wait a minute, Lisa Diamond is reaching out to me and like wants to talk to me. That was like so cool because
when I reached out to Cami Hurst because I was supervising her dissertation, and I'm like, Natasha, could you introduce us? I don't want to like just like send a weird email. Like, could you send an email and CC me on the email so I don't feel like a loser?
Well, and that's because you're doing a lot of research on shame and social systems and how all of these things interact. So where I would love to start the conversation today, which was so interesting and how you started talking about it, was you said something along the lines of so many people go to therapy, and I would totally agree with this as a therapist, go to therapy with this idea that they're going to sexually heal.
Mm.
And they're going to sexually heal in this kind of like processing that they imagine where they're going to return to some pre-existing unharmed version of themselves that somewhere along the way they got screwed up, right? And got harmed. And so they need to return to some unharmed version of yourself.
Yeah.
And the imagery that you shared that was so funny to me is that, you know, like you come out of the womb, like harmed, like screaming and screaming your guts out. And like, that was a pretty traumatic experience, right? Just to go through the birth canal or the C-section or however it was that you came through this, into this existence. Like there is no unharmed,
calm, perfect, whole, like that is such this, you know, every time people talk about like getting back, every time someone talks about getting back to something, I'm like, time moves forward. There is no going back ever. There is no premortal, natural, and I noticed this, you know, from the beginning of my interviews with my respondents, when they would be struggling to reinterpret their previous experiences in a way that made sense to them now. So, you know, one of the questions I asked them, and I had no theoretical basis for asking this question. I was like so exploratory. I said, what were your 3 strongest attractions that you ever remember having? And these were all women between the ages of 16 and 23. So they hadn't had a lot of life experience, but they had some. And one of the first things that happened is people say, well, what do you mean by attraction? And I was like, well, I don't know. We're like, yeah. And like, I can tell you, like this many years later, nobody in the field actually knows what an attraction is. So I still don't know. And I said, I don't know, just something like, it could be emotionally, it could be physical, whatever. And, you know, and they'd be describing these powerful experiences. And then if the gender of the person that they had had that experience with was different from the gender that they were currently interested in, they were like trying to figure out, like, was this a distortion? Was it a discovery? And there seemed to be an inability to just have experiences and not try to make them fit into a coherent beginning, middle, and end story. And it's funny to me because that's also what all people do. And I think probably all of therapy is a matter of trying to get you to stop telling all of the fancy stories you're telling and actually be able to tolerate the feelings and the complexities that you have without trying to force a meaning system in which this person was right, this is my true self, that was blah, 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 blah. And humans are narrative creatures. And I think a lot of our distress comes from trying to make stories out of impulses, feelings, desires, powerful sensations that don't make sense. And of course, religion is great at saying, oh, there is a meaning for that. And I think Mormonism in particular does a great job of saying, when you're seized by something, that's the spirit talking to you. And so I think a lot of folks' early sexual experiences, when they seize them and when they feel like something, it's almost impossible not to say, what does that mean? Instead of just being like, wow, you know, what's happening to my body. And so one of the things I think makes people struggle with changes in their sexuality over time is that we are so narrative. We so want to believe that there's a coherent thread that if anything doesn't fit, we become preoccupied with it and making it fit. Either the past was wrong or the present is wrong, but they can't possibly both be right. And yet when I followed women over time, that's what I found. Like there was this one woman who fell in love with her best friend and she's pretty much straight, but they had a 2-year affair and it was totally great. And then she spent the next 25 years involved with men, but she never once said that was false. She just said that was just kind of its time. And I now realize that like she was one of the healthiest people in the sample to just be like, that was what I was experiencing. That was what my desire felt like to me then. And now my desire feels different. Oh, well. And whereas other women would be like, am I this? Am I like, how could I have possibly felt that way? And as a psychologist, I'm like, because the human brain is designed to to be a sponge and to feel a whole bunch of things. And it's okay for it not to make sense. And it's okay for it to change. It doesn't mean that you were deluded then, and it doesn't mean that you're repressed now. You know, you could actually have two things be true at the same time. But when it comes to sexuality, that's not a comforting message for a lot of people.
Yeah, we're very binary, and there's this idea somehow that we need to figure out our sexuality by predetermined age, pretty much by puberty, right? Or a few years into puberty. And like you're saying, the narrative is pretty much predetermined by the culture or religion that you're a part of, that says this is what you're supposed to look like, this is how it's supposed to be. And so if you don't fit into those boxes, there's a lot of confusion. And you talked a lot about just your field of human development and how we develop, and that although we do have this drive towards human relationship, we also have this drive towards survival, and that those aren't always completely compatible because what drives us towards relationship and towards survival aren't always the same thing, right? In other words, relationships aren't always the healthiest. Survival will always trump. Does that?
And the benefit we get from social connection, like humans are more socially sensitive than any species. It's why people with good social connections live longer. Like, we absorb all of the good of we absorb more good from relationships than any other species, which means we also absorb more of the bad, which is what, like, human brains are wired for shame. We are wired for it. And so individuals who struggle with shame, I'm like, that's because you're a human, because humans evolved to be in groups. In order to be in a group, you need to be ready to figure out, what does this group want from me? And we do a great job of teaching that to kids with our facial expressions. If a kid steals from another kid, we go, that's nice. Those kids, they get that viscerally. Judgment is like, whoo! Our bodies respond to the judgment of the people we love because our brains are wired to say, figure out the rules of this group. And don't just learn them cognitively, feel them as judgment. Don't do that. Don't you do that. You know, we do the same thing with our dogs. And we are so sensitive to that. And it's exactly the same part of our nervous system that benefits from connection. We can't have one without the other. It's like the human paradox. You cannot get all the beauty of human relating without the sensitivity to shame and to social judgment. We are caught in this paradox forever.
Yeah. And so on the one hand, if I remember what you said correctly, we're trying to figure out how to fit into the group. But if and on the other hand, we're sexual beings, like, that's very ingrained into us. That's very primal, but we will suppress our sexuality hands down before we go against the survival we need to belong to the group.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can see why, LGBTQ plus folks, or even, we talked a lot about like duty obligatory sex during this summit, right? Or things that people that don't come naturally, or that we wouldn't call authentic. Why wouldn't people act authentically? Well, there's a good reason. And
also the belief system, and this is, I think, one of the things that makes religious traditions different is, by the time your brain is old enough to like tell yourself stories about what things mean, religious traditions do a great job of saying, it is the work of your faith tradition to resist human impulses, to resist the 7 deadly sins, lust, gluttony, blah, blah, that, those natural instincts, your job is to resist them. So there isn't any sort of like, you're a human, humans are great, like pizza tastes great, sugar tastes great. It's like, no. like your job is to resist. And it actually, this is the challenge that Christ has given you, is to resist. So in addition to the shame, you also now have a story. Oh, I'm feeling that way because it's right, because it's actually how I exalt God, is by suffering through resisting human impulses. That is a mark of like, that's, so it all fits together. Oh, I should hate my desires. I should hate all that because God wants me to resist temptation. Resisting temptation is how I show that I'm great. And so there's no story that says, just like, go ahead, masturbate, it's great, have fun. There's just none of that within religious traditions. And so there's no cognitive construct of you actually should enjoy your sexuality. I don't think there's like any, Mormon kid who, and they're like, oh, you will enjoy it once you're married. But even then, year after year of resist, there's, that does a number. That does a number on a developing brain. It just sets up a war between you and your basic sense of self.
Well, and even for the religious traditions that allow for marital sexual enjoyment between, a heterosexual couple, there's still, it's not usually just like, oh, now the floodgates open. It's usually, well, you have to stay within the confines of righteous sex, whatever that means for that culture, whether that's missionary position sex, whether that's only procreative sex, whether
for a while they outlawed oral sex.
In Mormon tradition, yes, for about 6 months, although for a lot of people that lasted a lot longer than 6 months.
I also remember
memo.
I heard an interview on Mormon Stories with a couple where the bishop actually told them during like their last little premarital interview, he said, this is very important. Do not bring mechanical devices.
Yeah, sex toy.
Into the bedroom. And he goes, I can tell you, it does not go well. Mm-hmm. And then they left being like, how's the bishop's wife? Like, what exactly didn't, like, he discovered that his wife could have an orgasm, just not with him. And they were just like, okay, I think we just learned a lot about our bishop. He has a complicated history with mechanical devices. So yeah, the idea that enhancing pleasure, like, why would you do that?
Yeah. Well, sexual media. So, I mean, lots of couples, even within the privileged cis heterosexual couplehood, which is kind of privileged in these religious communities, there's still a lot of shame. There's still a lot of no's. There's still a lot of, like you're saying, monitoring of that pleasure. So is there any, like you're saying, we're kind of, I don't want to stay too binary, like good or bad. So is there any usefulness for this? Like, is there any usefulness as to why these things exist to begin with? Or should we kind of evolve beyond? Should we just kind of like say, okay, these things maybe existed at one point for a reason, and it's really our job now to evolve beyond these kind of primal.
I've done a lot of reading in anthropology because this is a question I've struggled with, for my whole career. And one of the things I tell my students is that there is no human society on the planet that has no rules about sexuality. Mm-hmm. Every human society makes rules. The rules vary, and often they're about who you're allowed to have sex with, sometimes where and when. But I think every human society has recognized that this is a powerful human impulse, and therefore every human society has said, let's come up with some rules for how to do it. So I think that is probably a normal, natural, necessary function of human social living. But what you find is that some societies have rules that allow for a lot of creativity and a lot of variability and a lot of autonomy. And so the question is not rules or no rules. It's what rules, and also are the rules communicated as this is how we live, this is how our society functions, or are the rules focused around there's something wrong with you? And I think the dangerous thing is when the rules focus on, if you want to do anything other than what we're telling you, right? Ooh, you've got a yucky cancer inside of you. And that is what destroys people. I think saying, and I that's what the advice they give kids about, parents about kids and masturbation. Don't say that's bad. Say, when that happens, do it in your own room. Just be respectful of the rest of us. So I think there's a way to say, yeah, it's okay to have do's and don'ts, but let's phrase them as do's and don'ts around the complications of group social living, not, and respecting other people, consent, like, hey, make sure. But the problem is when the do's and don'ts come with this, like, there's something horrible about you deeply inside of you. And I think with sexuality, because we feel it so inside of us, our readiness to absorb those rules as judgment is so strong that it just worms its. I can't believe the long-term implications of sexual shame. I've never seen anything quite. It's just remarkable that for 50, 60 years, and it's become almost a trope, right? You see movies and TV shows. If somebody wants to have a character who does something completely unexplainable, murder someone, what do you do? What do we need to make the plot believable? Some weird sexual thing that happened when they were 6. Like, everybody seems to get that we mess you up. And so we know that we are doing some serious harm to folks when we inject that into them at an early age. It cannot be extracted overnight. And yeah, you can go to therapy and you can learn to unpack it. Will you ever completely get rid of it? Probably not, but you will be able to maybe have it as the backseat passenger in your car. Oh yes, there's that feeling again. Oh, now I know where that came from. I can set it aside. It's like, is it going to go away? No, I don't think it ever really goes away. I think all you can do is help people understand that is a passenger in their car. It just doesn't need to drive the car.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to really spend most of the rest of our time talking about this evolution of our personal sexualities, right? Kind of going back to this idea of we don't have to necessarily identify or get too committed to certain aspects of our sexuality. I mean, by all means, I want to be careful too, because if you want to identify as gay, or if you want to identify as straight, or if you want to identify as kinky, or if you want to identify as vanilla and you really resonate with those things, by all means, right? At the same time, I also have so many people that come into my office that are just kind of like you're saying, in these states of confusion, or, why was it that I did have sex with a same-sex partner when I was 15, but now consider myself straight? Does that mean I'm hiding a part of myself? Does that mean I'm not being honest with myself? Why is it that I've been straight for the last 25 years, but now I'm interested in something different? Why is it that why is it that I'm noticing my erotic taste shift or differ? And this is where a lot of what you were saying about why are we expecting ourselves to stay the same for 80, 90, however many years we're living these days? Why is that the go-to message about sexuality? And you really did tie it to this idea that if you can't show the church, for example, especially for those of us who grow up in these religious communities, if you can't show the church, now this is my identity, then you can't really have an excuse for being who you are. So I'd love to hear your ideas about just kind of how do we understand human sexuality, human development in a much more abstract way that allows us to, yes, identify and explore in ways that are just more self-determined, instead of culturally determined or religiously determined.
And we do such different things with sexuality than with almost any other area of personal development. Like, and I'm always aware of this when I, listen to kind of biographical interviews, and someone will be like, oh, tell us about your career development. Tell us about your educational development. Tell us about your style. Tell us about your, like, people are comfortable saying, oh, I was like this, and then this happened, involved, and this is what I think, and this is what I experienced. I used to hate spicy food, and now I love spicy food. I never used to be a hang glider, and now I do hang gliding. I wasn't really, and then I did this. And we celebrate self-determination as Americans, especially in every domain of life, except for one, which is gender and sexuality. The only allowable shift is from repression to freedom, and it's linear. You're only going one way, and there is no capacity to say my sexuality keeps changing, just like my intellectual development keeps changing. And it's just amazing to me that it is the only area in which we forbid like self-expansion and ongoing, it's almost like the Mormon Church, ongoing revelation. Like, there's like, why did you enjoy it? Maybe you had a ongoing sexual revelation, and it's just ongoing, and it keeps and we forbid that. And I think because we have a meaning system that really does think about sexuality as a property of you that you carry with you, I think even for a therapist to provide a safe environment to say, what if everything's okay? And what if you just go with the flow? That backstory in their head is like, no, that's not possible. Like, because that's almost, I think maybe the reason that we don't permit that is because it's a little scary, because sexuality is experienced as so kind of involving and motivating and frightening for someone who's been raised in sort of a sexually shaming culture, that the idea that you don't know where it's going, that it could continue to evolve, is a little terrifying. And I remember once speaking at a high school to a bunch of parents, and this was like in the early 2000s. And one of the parents was like, is there an age at which if my kid is gay, it will have shown up by then? Like, is it like 18? Like, is there a point at which, like, pretty much that's what you've got? You've either got a gay kid or you don't. And I said, no, I can't tell you that, for sure whether your kid is gay at 18. And I said, also can't reassure you that you're not gonna have a gay relationship. So actually, no, you'll never know. And like the faces were like, all right. Like, I think it's scary. And so probably the most important thing any therapist can do is keep saying, and that's okay too. That also okay. Am I going to say your life is going to be fantastic? No, but is all of this like manageable and okay? Yes, it like, maybe you'll never know. And that's also okay. But we have such a shaming culture. I'm not sure that a lot of folks will. I think it takes a lot of work for people to truly internalize a level of self-love and self-compassion that allows them to have desires that they don't understand and that scare them, especially for, kink. I think our culture makes it really, really hard for people to have a truly kind of warm and embracing and reassuring sense of their sexual desires.
Well, and I think too, like, as I have people come in, it's not just even religious expectations. It's, I think, cultural and media expectations. And when I think about our legal constructs and just cultural constructs around monogamy and couplehood, it's just these two people who are supposed to figure out life together, and they're supposed to be each other's only sexual partners, and you're supposed to be having kind of somewhat fantastic sex at least 2-3 times a week. And If that's
Despite
not
the fact that
happening,
everything in your brain is wired to habituate and to be like,
so then they come in with these kind of expectations that sex therapy is going to either fix my partner or fix me, because one of us is broken. So we do have a lot of broken narratives around sex.
And if you remove the brokenness, you'll get back to the way you were having sex in the first 18 months of the relationship. And I tell my students, by the way, in the first year of your sexual relationship with someone, you'll have sex more frequently than you ever will again with that person. So have fun. That is not coming back. That's a part of the relationship. That's not some essential sexual self. That's a relational phenomenon. And it's okay for it to change. It doesn't mean that you lost the spark. That is humanness. And so when people go into therapy thinking, we're going to remove the brokenness, and then it's going to be like it was before, then you're setting yourself up for disappointment. And you're also depriving yourself of the opportunity to discover that the ways in which you're, I say not broken, but adapted. We're all adapting all the time. Can also be the source of great pleasure and connection. That if you can figure out how your hurt parts and your partner's hurt parts, how you can figure out a way to live comfortably in a safe space, that is not a relationship that you had at the beginning either. And one of the things that I think that broken narrative really annoys me is that it denies the fact that everything that we struggle through is actually the source of greater pleasure and depth later on. And I tell my students this, and I'm like, I know you don't believe me. I wouldn't have believed me when I was your age. But every time you're having a really awful experience, really heartrending, that's going to actually be the source of your greatest joy later. You don't know it now. That's then you're finding out what you're struggling with. And if it's with a partner and you're struggling sexually with them, whatever that is, if you can have the courage and grace to go into it openly, I guarantee you that if you do that and you find happiness later, that happiness will have been created by what felt broken. It will actually benefit you. You are not trying to remove it. And I remember, I think, who was it that said something like this? Oh, it was the therapist that's on that Showtime reality series, Couples Therapy, which is just fantastic. And someone interviewed her and they said, what's one tip you can give couples? And she said, think about the hardest thing about your partner, the thing that gives you the most agita. And she said, think of that as the thorn from which the most growth will come. And that just that is it. It's not broken. It's not removing the irritant, removing the sexual problem, removing the thing. It's saying, ooh, I just found out what is really important or scary for me. And if instead of going away from it like a hot stove, you can go toward it with your partner and with a therapist and say, oh, wow, we just found out what we need to work on. We just found out what is the scariest thing. And if you can go toward that, that can actually be a source of pleasure, that you're not trying to avoid that shit. You're trying to use it to get better. And if people kind of went into therapy, not being I want to get back to the past, but I want to go toward a way more joyful future that includes my pain and includes my shame, but gives us a language to kind of talk about it.
Which gives a whole different perspective to things like trauma, or yes, like long-term coupled issues that feel like incompatibilities maybe at some point. And I'm not saying that at times there aren't incompatibilities, or that sometimes at points people aren't better off maybe, starting or, deciding to end their relationship. But for a lot of people, I think the expectation is always about change. We do live in a society that I think is about productivity and change and being able to acquire things instead of maybe more acceptance, and that evolution that I think, your presentation really made me think about is acceptance. So that if I am wondering, am I asexual or am I oppressed by my religion, it becomes less about worrying about that answer and more about sitting in my body and my lived experience, and where, like you're saying, is there potential for pleasure, regardless of whether that's going to come from an orgasm or a connection with a partner, or from sitting in the sun with warmth against my skin, and how can I learn to lean into those kinds of areas of acceptance.
And I think some religious traditions, and Mormonism for sure, they take that sort of American productivity ethic and they put it right into daily practice, reading the scriptures every day, doing the temple work, like progressing, and getting credit. That's another kind of weird thing about the LDS church, is it's like you go to the bishop and you get credit for your worthiness. You get it in a thing you can hold in your hand, right?
Yeah, I will recommend.
I mean, it's a brilliant, like you could design a better system, because it says, don't worry. Every bit of suffering that you do, you're going to get credit for it. And what is also interesting is that there's a lot of research in the psychological literature about how punishment creates pleasure. Every additional rule you have that you can obey gives you a form of pleasure in escaping punishment. Like, oh, you better cover your shoulders. And so then finding the modest outfit becomes a source of pleasure. I've done it again. And every time you escape punishment, you're getting credit for it. So it sets up this system where you always have to be progressing and avoiding punishment. And so there is no reality in which you just sit and experience yourself, because you are constantly self-monitoring, other monitoring. Do you see the garment line? Are you doing this? Are you doing that? Have you tried? Yes, I did my tithing. I have not had a single, cup of coffee. Like, you're getting credit for avoiding punishment. So it replaces normal human pleasure, enjoying, your food, enjoying sex, with the pleasure of approval and escaping of punishment. And you have checked all the box, you will proceed to the celestial kingdom. So, it's such a, and it's, it's just like going back to Max Weber and the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, that you are working to prove your worthiness and your salvation to yourself and to everybody else. So the option of sitting and being, which is like more in the Buddhist tradition, is not an option. If you are not moving forward, then you're just off the chart.
Yeah, Kelly Nichols, who's watching, says it's exhausting, which I do agree it is. At the same time, I think when you're in it to win it, I don't know that you're very attuned to the exhaustion of it.
And it feels reassuring, because with that many opportunities to be told that you are or are not escaping punishment, you can go through every day feeling like, look at me, I'm dressed appropriately, I'm keeping sweet, I am doing all the things, and the eyes of others and the judgment of others is reassuring. And that is a great way to avoid the clanging in the back of your head that is like, oh no, I want to do things that I should not do.
And I think the dilemma too, as I've worked with many people leaving high demand religions, is that this doesn't necessarily completely go away. There's all of these ways that we get credit exist in other systems, right? They exist in post-religious communities. They exist in academia. They exist in jobs. They exist in family systems. They exist even like if you go to the new, yogi space where you are now going to train to be
I think I've noticed that a lot of folks who leave high demand religions or other kind of culty things, and it's even called cult hopping. The loss of structure they can't tolerate. So I've noticed a lot of compulsive exercise and compulsive eating, like they'll go into fitness and it seems like, oh, I'm coming to love my body. And that's great. But if you want credit, and I notice it's like the obsessive tracking of how many reps, and it's like, oh, you've just replaced one, or you're like, oh, spiritual practice, I'm going to become a thing, or, oh, I'm going to start a business. And I feel like one of the things that probably we could do a better job of is realizing that for folks who are moving out of that really high demand approach that have a lot of shame, unless that shame is unpacked, it's just going to come out elsewhere. And I've seen it in my students where then the source of shame is not getting straight A's. And it's the same very compulsive, I did all the assignments right, I don't know why I'm not getting an A+. And it'll be like, ooh, something more is going on here. I see it with eating and exercise. So I feel like for people moving out of that, there's going to be a vulnerable time where their nervous system is going to be looking for something to replace the day-to-day reassurance that they got from the church. The day-to-day feeling of, I'm dressed right, I'm acting right, everyone is looking at me right. When you take that away, you can't build self-acceptance and autonomy overnight. If you've spent 20 years in a tradition that says, don't trust your instincts, look to us, we'll tell you, you can't undo that overnight. So it's like, there needs to be like a transitional structure or something that will say, like, while you're learning how to follow your own impulses, try not to just put all that energy into a new approval seeking practice, because it'll lead you to the same place. And I really worry about this a lot with gender diverse folks, because often the long struggle with their self-presentation and their gender and an intense focus on their bodies and how their bodies are perceived. I just see these on TikTok all the time. There's like a whole bunch of obsessive compulsive body modification and exercise, and do I look like the right gender? And that is affirming at the beginning, but it can quickly cross the line into, if I don't meet the right standard, I'm in trouble again. And I sort of feel like shame is kind of like cancer. If you cut almost all of it out, but you leave a little bit, that little bit will find a new home, whether it's your obsessive yoga practice, you've got to find a way to make a new way of thinking that doesn't revolve around, I'm going to beat down that corner of shame by finding something objective that I can do every day, that I can get credit for, that can reassure me every day that I'm okay. That I look okay, that I'm acting okay, that I'm getting straight A's, or I'm doing something. I'm gonna, I also see it on social media. I've got all these followers, I've got all these likes. If you let that shame persist, it will just find a new home. It's kind of like rats in your house. You close one avenue, it'll find a new one.
Yeah. And I see this even like with things that I'm a huge proponent for, like even helping people explore ethical non-monogamy or entering new communities, where again, but it can, a lot of times I hear from people where it just turns into a new shame game. It's like either from their partner that, oh, you're not progressive enough, or you're not this enough, or you're not that enough. because you're not thinking like me or experiencing it like me, or in the community itself, it's like you're not following, again, like our group rules, right? Or our group expectations. So yeah, I do think it's something, it's fairly, it's kind of a human trait, I think is what we're getting at. It's probably more intense in high demand religious spaces. And I think we have more to learn or more to unpack, as you're saying, when we're leaving those spaces, but it's not something that just doesn't exist everywhere else either. Mm-hmm. So it's tricky, right? It's like this ongoing relationship with ourselves and with our communities. And
I think, probably again, like that's where I think therapists that can be a partner in that process of like, okay, so, how do you feel on the days that you don't go to the yoga class at 6 a.m.? And like, just keep, have a second voice in your head and the voice of the therapist saying, you could also decide not to. You could also change your mind at any point and nothing disastrous. Like your safety is not built on some practice. And I so firmly believe that what really matters in terms of folks in that position is having at least one person in their life who truly shows them unconditional love and acceptance, who truly just couldn't care. And for some folks, the model of that is like, a parent, but it doesn't need to be a parent. It might be a lover. It might be the therapist. It might be a close friend. It might be someone who's like, yeah, I don't care. So you're doing this now? Cool. Whatever. And that having a relationship where they feel like they matter so much to someone that that person will always be there. That I think is the key. And that maybe the thing to do as people are easing that transition is to figure out who is that person for you. And it may not be like a really close friend. Like I think for some people, it's a teacher or a coach or someone that they know is just always like, yeah, you're always important to me. And having one reference point that's like, to this person, they always show up for me. I can call, I can send them any text, I can send them any email. I will always get a response. I truly now feel that because of our social nature, we have to heal through relationships. And sometimes a therapist is the only person in that person's life to do that, but it doesn't have to be that. And I think therapists can often help people identify who are the folks that have made you realize that you matter, that you really matter, just because you're you. And spend more time with that person. Stay in touch with that person. Remind yourself that you could give them a whole list of all the wonderful things you did, and they'll be like, yeah, I don't care. I don't care. And it's funny because we come, as children, it's a very common thing. Oh, I achieve all this stuff for my parent, and they don't even notice. Well, that's the point. The point is for your parents to be like, yeah, I don't care what you achieve. I just freaking love you, every single part of you. That's what we need, unconditional mattering.
I love that. Well, I know that through my studies and through people like you and your work, I have given myself permission to think about my sexuality much differently throughout the last, probably 20 years of my life. And that's been hugely eye-opening, hugely differing in what I've been able to experience in my own life. I hope that people can, start thinking about these things very differently in their own lives. As far as, I think that's where it starts a lot of times too, is permission. Mm-hmm. And like you're saying, also those relationships and finding.
I think it's so important for aging too. It's like I noticed that there's so many more films and television shows that show older couples and older people being sexual. That's kind of revolutionary because like no one ever wants to see that. And, if you are not willing to be flexible about your sexuality as you age, you're going to come up with a reckoning because our bodies change. They need different things, different parts work different ways. And if you have a new way of relating sexually when you're 70, that's not a loss. That's just, this is what your 70-year-old sexuality looks like. And that's not like, oh, I've lost the whatever kind of sex I had before. It's like, wow, what is available to me now? And I think for everyone to think about their sexuality as an ongoing, forward moving thing that also recreates itself around the people that you're having sex with. They have different needs than you do. And so the magic of any couple is what's our sweet spot? It doesn't have to be everything. It just has to be the best that we can do with our adaptations.
I love that. Ongoing creativity, ongoing evolution, and ongoing permission. Mm-hmm. So I hope that's what everybody gets out of today. Thank you, Lisa, for your time. You're amazing.
You're amazing.
Love knowing you. Let's change the world one shame-free step at a time.
The eradication of sexual shame I do believe it's a public health priority.
I agree. It is. That's one of my things, right? Sexual shame is a public health crisis. That's one of the things I like to say. So there we go.
So true. So true.
There we go. Well, thank you for being with us today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. You can find Natasha on Facebook at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CSTS, and at Natasha Helfer MFT on Instagram and TikTok. You can find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The intro and outro music for this episode is by Otter Creek. This podcast was edited by Ashley Puccini.
There is a place where time slows to nature's pace, and there is space there to find yourself in her embrace. Some places should be left alone. So we can always go to the homeland of the heart. 10,000 years of our human history etched on her canyon walls, alongside Earth's mysteries. Some places should be left alone. So we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart. Deep in our cities, we sleep without her stars, yet still her presence sustains us from afar. Some places should be left alone. So we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland.